Alright, listen, it's like 80 something degrees out right now, but considering the circumstances of this video, I gotta get the Minnesota beanie on. As I'm sure everyone knows, on July 21st, President Joe Biden dropped out of the 2024 presidential election, leading to Vice President Kamala Harris being the presumptive nominee for the Democratic Party. The question on everyone's mind, if Kamala Harris is now the presidential nominee, then who's the vice presidential nominee going to be? Many big names came up. Governor of Pennsylvania, Josh Shapiro. Governor of North Carolina, Roy Cooper. Senator from Arizona, Mark Kelly. Governor of Kentucky, Andy Beshear. Huge names from across the country. Very few people. We're talking about Governor of Minnesota, Tim Walz. In fact, he started below 1% odds on the gambling site Polymarket. I don't have a screenshot for this, but you gotta believe me, I remember this clearly. So who even knows this Tim Walz figure? Who would actually push for this guy to be Kamala's VP? What genius knew that he would go viral across the internet for his TV interviews, have his progressive record of getting stuff done be brought to national attention, and ultimately get the vice president pick? On a completely unrelated note, here's a bunch of screenshots of me pushing Tim Walz for VP before Biden even dropped out. Alright, it wasn't just me. Pretty much every political Minnesotan and some of the most obsessive political nerds smelled an opportunity for Walz when Biden dropped out, for reasons I'll get into later. To be honest, I didn't even want to make this video. I've been wanting to make longer video essays, but I feel it's my duty as a proud Minnesotan to brag about and explain why Tim Walz was picked to be vice president. Like I talked about in my JD Vance video, balancing a ticket is very important. For the Democratic Party, a much more racially diverse party compared to the Republicans, it's pretty important to balance a ticket from both a racial and a gender perspective. So when a woman of color became the Democratic nominee, pretty much everyone knew that the vice president was going to be a white man. And Kamala Harris, as a Californian, needed someone that could appeal to middle America, someone who people didn't view as a coastal elite. Then we have the obvious factors, like actually being qualified to be vice president, and delivering a demographic that would be beneficial in winning the election. And this left several notable candidates, including Alright, let's go through some of the candidates. First up, we got this guy, Senator Mark Kelly of Arizona. He won some impressive elections in 2020 and 2022, and was favored by some of the people from Obama world. He would also help in one of the most important swing states, Arizona, and he's an astronaut, so that's pretty cool, I guess. He was widely seen as the most likely candidate for a pretty considerable period of time, leading in gambling markets. Again, on a completely unrelated note, here's me saying that it wasn't going to be him when he was leading. Listen, man, you gotta let me be a little cocky here. There's 3 reasons why I didn't think it was going to be Kelly. Firstly, he's a senator from Arizona, so if he took the vice president position, there'd be a special election in 2026 that Democrats could potentially lose, which would make retaining or gaining the Senate, depending on the 2024 election, way more difficult. Secondly, he has no gas, no fire. A big part of the Kamala Harris campaign has been using this insane new wave of enthusiasm to get donations and campaign across the country. Mark Kelly had no enthusiasm, there were no clips of him going viral, no articles being shared about what a great pick he would be. And lastly, his hesitance to support the PRO Act had earned him enemies in labor. And you don't mess with labor in the Democratic Party. Alright, who do we got next? Governor of North Carolina, Roy Cooper. Roy Cooper was a pretty good pick in my opinion, considering how he won North Carolina in 2016 and 2020 when the Democratic presidential nominees both lost there. But he had 2 main problems. Firstly, he was kind of old. 67 really isn't that old in politics, but considering how the Harris campaign needs to be able to distance themselves from Biden's age, 67 might be a little bit too old. Secondly, and much more notably, the lieutenant governor of North Carolina is this guy, Mark Robinson, a Republican. And a pretty far right one at that. So when Roy Cooper would be out campaigning, a Republican would be in charge of running the state. As a result, Roy Cooper ended up pulling out of the vetting process himself. Then we got Governor of Kentucky, Andy Beshear. I actually talk about him a good bit in my video on the 2023 election, so go check that out if you're interested. He's won a decisively red state twice as governor, while running as a pretty mainstream Democrat. His electoral victories have been extremely impressive, and was my second choice and the choice of a lot of Democrats. And as a bonus, President of the United Auto Workers, Shawn Fain, had said many of their members supported him, including him himself.
2 names really resonate high with our union. The top name Andy Beshear. I'm a huge Andy Beshear fan. I believe Andy Beshear, he's been there with us every step of the way.
And Beshear had a ton of online support and momentum for him. So what happened? Now, to be honest, I don't know. My main guess is that Kamala's campaign viewed Beshear as just a worse Walz. Someone that could energize the base and appeal to middle America without making anyone mad, but ultimately someone that couldn't energize the base as much as Walz could. Beshear didn't make it to the final round of interviews. There's also the theory that he was a little bit desperate in his attempts to get the vice president position, including a kind of reaching too far on the Diet Mountain Dew thing, which you can look up if you're interested. I'm not going to get into that here. Anyways, before we get into the main candidate, let's talk about some of the less likely candidates from the get-go that didn't make it very far. First, we got Governor of Illinois, J.B. Pritzker. Favored among some progressives, he never really made it far in the Veep stakes. Illinois having the city of Chicago sort of makes him seem like an urban type instead of the suburban and rural vibe the Harris campaign needed. Also, him coming from a billionaire family wouldn't help in making a working class versus a billionaire Trump messaging. Next, we have Pete Buttigieg, the favorite among resist liberals. He never really took off, most likely due to his love of spotlight, might lead to him taking attention from Kamala, and because the Kamala Harris campaign needs someone not so attached to the Biden administration. She already had that part of the campaign down. She needed a vice president that had their own record separate from Biden. And then lastly, we had Governor of Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer. I'm going to be honest, if Kamala Harris was a man, Big Gretch would have been the vice president pick. But more likely than not, the Harris campaign didn't want two women on the ticket for electoral reasons. It's sad, but true. So, that leads us to the man that was one phone call away from being vice president. Governor of Pennsylvania, Josh Shapiro. At the end of the day, it seemed it was down to him or Walz. Shapiro was quite an impressive candidate. He had won his governor race by 15 points in a very close state. He's a strong public speaker, and he would help in delivering Pennsylvania for Harris in November. He seemed like an obvious pick. So why wasn't it him? Well, for starters, he's only been governor for 2 years. This didn't seem to be much of a concern for most people, but to me, he didn't have the experience to be vice president, and that might have influenced Harris's decision. More notably, though, he violated the most important rule for a vice presidential pick. Do no harm. In college, Shapiro had written against a two-state solution in the Israel-Palestine region, and had previously served as a member of the Israeli Defense Force. Listen, when the party is so extremely divided on the whole Gaza conflict, and Kamala is finally managing to reach out to the more die-hard Palestine supporters, messing that up by picking Shapiro was a great risk. His past support of school vouchers also made him less popular among progressives and even some mainstream Democrats. And this lost him support among unions. Still, with his charismatic speaking and his impressive electoral abilities, it had to be him. I mean, who else could it be? Alright, I'll stop this. I already brought him up. I'm a Minnesotan. So I follow Minnesotan politics more closely than I do any other state. Duh. In 2022, the impossible happened in Minnesota. The DFL, which is the Minnesota Democratic Party, means Democratic Farmer Labor Party. It's a long story. The DFL flipped the state Senate while retaining the state House and the governorship. So for the first time in over a decade, they held a trifecta. But only by one state Senate seat, an insanely small majority. I mean, states like New York and California with massive majorities still succumb to infighting and government inefficiencies. Surely, Minnesota, a much more purple state, wouldn't be able to pass progressive legislation with such a small majority, right? Wrong.
I mean, a perfect example is what's happening in Minnesota right now. Minnesota has a one-seat Democrat majority. We got universal free school meals, legal weed, carbon-free electricity by 2040, tax rebates for the working class up to $1,300 if you make under $150,000 a year, 12 weeks paid family leave, 12 weeks paid sick leave. They banned conversion therapy. They did red flag laws for guns. They did universal background checks for guns. They did automatic voter registration, public free college if you make under 80K, a ban on PFAs, which is the forever chemicals, $2.2 billion increase in K-12 school funding, sectoral bargaining for nursing home workers. These things are all not little wins. They are huge wins.
The DFL gets stuff done. A lot of stuff. In just a year. An insane amount of stuff, even. The DFL gained national recognition from figures like Barack Obama for their work in legislation. And I'm not going to act like Governor Tim Walz was responsible for this. A lot of DFLers, myself included, would argue that the legislature's unity was the primary cause of this. But objectively, as the governor, Tim Walz became the face of this legislation, and he managed to work successfully with the legislature and got out of the way when he needed to. This impressive legislative record and experience was why I thought he'd be a good fit for vice president when not many were talking about him. And although more Democratic than both, Minnesota has similar demographics and culture to Wisconsin and Michigan. Crucial swing states. Also, he had a pretty good record for appealing to Middle America. A member of the National Guard, then a teacher and high school football coach before going to Congress. He's basically a Democratic version of George Cooper. Anyways, he had an extremely relatable career and understood what it was like to be working class. Still, he had far more appealing candidates to compete against, like mentioned before. He was only really popular among Minnesotans and some niche progressives. So, what happened?
These are weird people on the other side. They want to take books away. They want to be in your exam room. That's what it comes down to. And don't, get sugarcoating this. These are weird ideas.
Yeah, mega viral. It was everywhere. I mean, you even had people like J.D. Vance and Donald Trump himself commenting on it.
Well, they're the weird ones. And if you've ever seen her with the laugh and everything else, that's a weird deal going on there. They're the weird ones. Nobody's ever called me weird.
Walz made making fun of Republicans fun again in a way no one else had done before. And this newfound national fame from this Republicans are weird shtick led to people looking into his background as governor, and they were impressed. He climbed the percentages on gambling markets, and while Beshear, Kelly, and Cooper began to fall, he became even with Shapiro, neck and neck. It was either Shapiro or Walz. At the end of the day, it just came down to chemistry. Kamala Harris and Tim Walz reportedly got along very well and just seemed to click. Getting along with your VP is obviously important. You're stuck working with this person for at least 4 years if you win. On top of that, the Harris campaign heard the enthusiasm for Walz. And an added bonus, as a Democratic operative put it, Walz talks and looks a lot like the voters we've lost to Trump. Their chemistry and the enthusiasm for Walz seemed to be the deal breaker. It also didn't hurt that big names like Nancy Pelosi had mentioned supporting Walz. Oh, and remember how I kept bringing up labor and how important they were, and how they preferred Beshear? Let's play the rest of that clip.
And then also Governor Walz in Minnesota.
Walz did no harm, and that is why he was the vice presidential pick. Last thing, Republicans seem to be pretty surprised with Kamala Harris picking Tim Walz. They were expecting and preparing for Josh Shapiro, and it seemed like they were more scared of him than they were Walz. Now, I'm going to make a bold prediction and say they're wrong about being more scared of Shapiro. Shapiro represented an old way of playing the game. Pick the popular governor to try and lock down the state. I don't think they're quite prepared for what's coming. The weird messaging has gone viral for a reason, and Tim Walz is the chief architect of it. I think Walz will be able to capitalize on this even further and continue to appeal to the Midwestern working class that Harris will need to win. And it seems to me that the GOP is completely unprepared to handle it. And of course, one last thing. Minnesota wins these.